Stacy.
Hi.
Hi. Great to have you on the podcast. I'd heard about your book, which is this. I've read not all of it, but most of it, The Killing Fields of East New York. And what I've read so far is very engrossing. How you've managed to combine the housing, what was happening in housing, and the corruption that was going on in there to the later murder rates of New York. It's a fascinating book, and from what I've read of this, it's just very compelling. So yeah, it's been a
Thank you.
read. Um, But first of all, for those who don't know who you are, can you just explain who you are and what led you to write this book?
Sure. I'm a writer, and I write nonfiction books. And after my most recent book before this, my publisher asked me if I would consider writing a true crime book. And because true crime sells. But I'm not really a true crime person. I'm not into it. But I had once written a book about the NYPD's cold case squad,
Mhm,
and they go back and try to solve old unsolved homicides.
mhm,
And in the process of researching that book, I learned that East New York, which is in Brooklyn, has had the highest number of unsolved homicides.
mhm.
And I never forgot that. So when she asked me that, I just immediately clicked on that and I thought, yeah, why East New York? It's not the only not so great neighborhood in New York City. So I thought maybe there's a story there. And when I looked into it, I found this story, which is basically the story I'd been looking for 20 years.
Mm, cool. So, like every good story, starts at the beginning. So, in regards to before the laws that President Johnson brought in the 60s, what was the housing market like in terms of A, being able to afford the price and B, actually being able to rent the price? Was it easy? Was it difficult? Like, how was the housing market at that particular time?
Well, the programs that and laws that Johnson brought into being were specifically targeted to people of color. Like the housing market was just okay if you were white, but not so okay if you weren't. And racial discrimination in all forms was rampant in the United States. So these laws were meant to address housing discrimination. So the Civil Rights Act of 1968 made housing discrimination illegal, and the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968 created programs that made it easier for middle income and working class families of color to buy homes. So that's what that was about. Um, Unfortunately, financial criminals just took one look at these programs and saw a way that they could get rich by scamming these programs.
Just go back a little bit with Johnson's laws that he brought in. Obviously, that's focusing on the housing market. Did it also focus on the banks in regards to who they gave the mortgages to, or was that something that was unaffected?
Uh, well, again, it was targeted families of color. So the United States had programs that helped middle class and working class families buy homes since the 30s.
Yeah.
But these programs, only 3% of the time, were used to help families of color. So these two laws were meant to address that. So the the programs are actually very similar. It gave people longer time to pay off the loans. Some of them also helped with the interest on the loans. And by insuring these loans, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, would insure these loans. And by insuring these loans, which are considered riskier loans, it made them more attractive to banks. So if the homeowners foreclosed on these loans that they insured, the FHA would pay out the loan, pay out the mortgage.
Okay.
Is that what you're trying to find out?
Yeah, yeah, more or less, yeah. Because obviously, from what I gather, the laws that Johnson brought in were obviously to help people of color in regards to obtaining a house as well. I
Yeah.
imagine part of that would have been about the banks as well, in terms of how like you were as a person of color to get like a mortgage and whatnot.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. It People of color, it was almost impossible to get, loans, especially in, neighborhoods that had been redlined. So what happened, in the 50s and 60s was real estate brokers went into, neighborhoods and terrified people, white homeowners, into selling their homes, with the threat that families of color were going to move in, their property values would go down, crime would go up, and they'd lose all their equity. And they didn't just do this once, they would go in continually, knocking on the door, sending postcards, sending letters, calling them. Taking out ads in the paper, and people eventually said, "Okay, I'm getting out of here." So that was called blockbusting.
mhm.
And that led to redlining. Once neighborhoods became neighborhoods of color, banks would no longer give mortgages or other financial services. So when these laws came into place, so when these laws came into place, mortgage banks and real estate brokers targeted these people, families of color that were trying to find homes, and the red blockbusting and redlining had already kind of created this market, not this market, but available houses for them to buy for very low prices. And normally when the FHA, I'm sorry if I'm kind of jumping around.
Yeah, okay.
Normally, when the FHA agrees to insure a mortgage, they'll come in, they'll appraise the house. If there's anything that they feel needs to be fixed, like the roof needs fixing, the boiler needs to be replaced, before they will insure that loan, those things need to be fixed. Um, so the mortgage banks befriended appraisers within the FHA and started bribing them to say that these things had been fixed when they weren't. So they would buy a home, for next to nothing, throw on a coat of paint, and then sell it for twice the price, targeting families that never thought that they would be able to buy a home. They go, like someone might come in and say, I want to rent a home, and they go, "Why rent a home? You can buy it." Oh, and that was another thing. The programs made it so that you could buy a home for very low down payment. So
Mhm.
they say, pay $200, you've got a home, and now you own it. You never have to deal with landlords again. These families would move into homes that were essentially falling apart, and within a month or two, the ceiling had caved in. People would fall through holes in the floor. They'd realize the boiler didn't work, and they'd be stuck with this home. And also, they would inflate the, homeowner's income, so the FHA would think, "Oh, they can make these mortgage payments, no problem," but often they couldn't. They'd abandon the home, the homes would be foreclosed, and what happened in East New York, and it wasn't just in East New York, this is going on nationwide, I just used East New York as my example.
Yeah.
So, within just a couple of years, thousands of homes in East New York had been abandoned. And what would happen was just the presence of these homes just spread blight throughout the neighborhood. It would start by maybe kids and teenagers breaking into these homes and partying, leaving the water running, and so floors would get soaked and collapse. They break the windows. Others would come and steal anything worth stealing, like copper wiring and pipes. And pretty soon they were just dilapidated things. Very often they would catch on fire and burn to the ground, so that where there were once abandoned buildings, they were now empty lots spread throughout New York. At a certain point, I think it was one-fifth of East New York was empty lots, abandoned land. And I found this quote where this law enforcement officer said they used to go through East New York, and when a house was burned, the only thing left standing was the chimney. So you go through the street, and there were just these chimneys, and he called it the East New York National Forest.
Go- Gosh, I mean, that's how they were able to get away with that for so long. I have no idea. It's even though I read it in the book, hearing you say it is quite shocking to me, to be honest. And just, but then if you're family and you're desperate for somewhere to set some roots, you go kind of imagine at that time you'd have to take it or leave it. Would that be a fair assessment?
Well, they didn't know what they were getting into. It wasn't like they even needed to think that way. The houses looked okay if you weren't looking closely.
Hmm.
And I I mean, I look back on what happened and it just kills me. It just breaks my heart. The country was in such turmoil at the time. This is the late 1960s. And this whole thing started because there were riots throughout the country based on civil rights, the lack of civil
Yeah.
rights. And President Johnson at the time put together this committee, which came to be known as the Kerner Commission, to study the riots and tell them why people were rioting. I mean, when you look back, you think, oh my God, it's so obvious why
Yeah,
people were
yeah, yeah,
rioting.
yeah.
Um, but it's a very earnest, hardworking group of men, only men, who looked at the problem and came back with a report that basically said they're happening because America is a racist country. And they went into great detail, just why they were saying that. And they showed the progression in all the cities where the riots were occurring and what people were responding to exactly. And they made the list of the biggest problems. I mean, racial discrimination existed in every possible arena that you could look at, but they identified the largest problems, which were the police department, housing, and employment. And I think the reason why Johnson focused on housing is because of all those problems, this was the one he had the best chance of solving or making a difference. The police department, I mean, most people didn't even think the police they still don't think that the police are a problem, but back then it was inconceivable. So chances of um, rehabilitating the police departments nationwide, that wasn't going to happen. Employment, that would was more insurmountable than housing. Housing, he thought, well, we could just throw some money at the problem and fix it. And that's where these programs came from.
Wasn't there a case in East New York as well that, unlike other parts of the city, the people, I don't know if it was the public themselves or officials, had taken away some of the road signs, so you got lost very easily within that part of the city. Is that true?
Oh, those were stealed because they were sold for scrap metal. So petty thieves were stealing those road signs. But you're right. At a certain point, East New York didn't have road signs. So I mean, if you grew up there, that was not an issue. But if I had this priest who told me, like, when he first got to East New York, to serve at his parish, he constantly had to ask people, "Where am I? What road am I standing on right now?" And it could be a more serious problem, like if an ambulance had to come get you, how are they gonna find you? Um,
Hmm.
I spoke to this guy from the fire department who told me this incredible story. East New York, not surprisingly, had one of the busiest fire departments in New York City. I think I think there were like 5 engines and trucks, and they went out on roughly 10,000 runs each a year addressing fires. I described it in the book like a game of whack-a-mole, just going around putting out fires. But he said it was so busy that sometimes they would be given a break and they would bring in firefighters from another borough of Queens to take their place. But they would get on the fire would be called, they get on the truck, and then they had no idea of how to get there. So they did these handwritten route cards for every place in East New York where they would have to go, and they'd say, Go left, go right, 2 lefts, 2 right." And he said, but the problem was If they take the route cards with them and, get to a fire, if they're called to another fire, they would have to go back to the firehouse because all the route cards began with at the firehouse. I couldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So insanity. And uh, because this was happening to neighborhoods of color, I mean, that helped these criminals commit their crimes because they knew that um, if they had tried to pull this off in a white neighborhood, there would be a response. But if doing it in a where black families and Puerto Rican families were lived, there would be a slower response, if any. And in many cases, the city responded by going into retreat. They stopped picking up garbage. The people of East New York claimed that the fire department responded slower and less to these fires, allowing the buildings to burn to the ground. I could not find evidence of that. I'm not saying that people were wrong, but I couldn't confirm
Mm.
it. Um, criminals, it, criminals of all kinds just ran rampant, and that I can't blame the police department too much in this instance because nothing like this had ever happened before. I mean, this neighborhood was totaled what felt like overnight. I found so many stories where people like I found a Vietnam veteran who had been drafted, and when he came back, his neighborhood was unrecognizable. He said that every block had 3 or 4 buildings either abandoned or completely gone. And this had never happened before. Like, crime didn't just jump like that anywhere before, and there were no policies or procedures in place to respond to that. This one guy spoke to the Senate about it, and he was saying how quickly it happened. Like, so there were projects in East New York that were once sanctuaries. I talked to people who grew up in them, and they said they loved them. They're wonderful places to grow up. And just like the neighborhood overnight, it just changed. And this guy said it's so easy to occur. You take a few criminals to move into a building and start terrorizing their neighbors. They start leaving, more criminals move in their place, and the, within months or a year, they own the building. And how do you police that? And you just can't go in and arrest all the people in the building that like and this is I'm not it wasn't happening at just one building. It's happening throughout East New York.
We've talked about houses, but I imagine something like that would affect other important buildings like hospitals and schools. Like I imagine something like with schools, they trying to in that area, trying to retain teachers must have been very difficult because one, like I said, the high levels of crime, and would you want to be a teacher in that place as well? And also, like I say, if a lot of them are abandoned anyway, like how many families are there? And then which leads on to how many kids are going to be attending the schools in the first place?
Well, most most families of color stayed there because they didn't have any choice. They had fewer options of where to live. It was one of the few affordable housing neighborhoods in New York. So many families chose to stay there and fight it out. But you're right. This I try to detail in this book chapter by chapter that every area of their life was affected negatively.
Mhm.
Healthcare. They didn't have many hospitals to begin with, and they had fewer as time went on. Hospitals closed one by one. One hospital lost their accreditation, but it stayed open because they needed the beds. I already said garbage was picked up less, so it was allowed to pile up. That brought in rats. Um, I'm trying to think of what I forgot. They built the landfill, which became toxic. Uh,
There must be a rat problem as well, like vermin. That must have increased tenfold because of.
oh God, yeah. Oh God, yeah. I found these. rat reports at the municipal archives. This is where the records of New York City government and administration are stored. And I found these old rat reports where they tried to count the number of rats and address the number of rats. And terrible stories of rats attacking children in their cribs and the elderly. There, again, there was just, it affected everything. Terribly, and little was done, because it was a neighborhood of color. They could get away with it. It's
Crazy.
a I mean, it just the one part that killed me is the FHA had this one policy when, before they would pay out the mortgage, and when the building is foreclosed, it had to be emptied. And what a number of families did, these were 2 and 3 family buildings, they would, take in renters to help pay their mortgage. And so renters who had, paid their rent, faithfully month by month would be evicted too. So people in Brooklyn and in Queens sued the FHA for this vacancy rule that they had. And the FHA fought it. And I found that at the very time that the FHA fought, making these, insisting that these buildings be vacant, had a section in their newsletter, um, all about how vacant buildings are bad. Vacant buildings spread blight. We don't want vacant buildings. So here they are saying vacant buildings are bad, fighting in court to allow them to make more vacant buildings.
Mad. I mean, for the and what this we're talking what just under 60 years ago this was happening. I mean, that's crazy. That
It's very recent, and I'm not an expert on what's going on now. I'm more a history person, but the Newsday did an expose a couple of years ago. I forget exactly when, where they sent people out to Long Island to try to buy a home, and so they would first send a family of color through and a white family through, and they found that the black families were discriminated against, and the white people got homes. So it's still going on, and what if you want to destroy a society? I can't think of a better way than by starting by destroying their home. I mean, it just means everything. It's like I'm in my apartment right now. This is my sanctuary. This is where I go to chill out and feel safe and comfortable from whatever else is going on in my life. If I had to come home to a place where I feared for my life,
Mhm.
it would destroy me as a human being. It would destroy my community. It would destroy the society I lived in.
Yeah. Were there any politicians at this time that were thinking, we've got to do something about this? And how loud were their voices amongst all the other politicians in, especially that part of New York?
There were politicians. Uh, that so in my book I outline the people who first became aware of the problem. And in New York, the Secretary of State had a group of investigators who would regularly, I
Mhm.
can't talk, um, investigate blockbusting. And they were very proud of their record of finding and arresting and prosecuting blockbusters. And so they were out on what they thought was a routine investigation, and they found that the family that had bought the home that had been blockbusted had no source of income. And this was a nice home. I think it was around $20,000, which sounds like nothing now.
Yeah.
But at the time, that was about the price for a nice suburban home, and so they had paid $20,000 for a slum in the city. But what stood out to them was they knew that there were programs making it easier for people to get mortgage loans. Um, people of lower income to get mortgage loans, but this is a family with no income. So how did they get the loan? And so they brought in a bunch of families and seeing how widespread this was, and then they brought in a bunch of realtors. Like, why did you sell people these homes?
Yeah.
And this guy that tipped them off to what was going on and explained the whole process of what they were doing. He was basically admitting to crimes. And they so the guy said, "Do you want a lawyer?" And the guy said, "I don't need a lawyer. Everyone's doing it." This is how safe they felt from prosecution. And but the guy that was interviewing them said he was shocked. He said, "Don't you know who you're doing this to? You know, you're doing it to poor families, like the most vulnerable people in New York. These are the people that you're hurting. You're taking away everything. You're destroying their lives." And the guy's attitude was, "Everyone's doing it. You know, why shouldn't I?" And I found an exact, almost exact repeat of this scene in the movie The Big Short,
Yeah.
which was by the way, I didn't mention, but this crime that the white collar criminals were perpetuating, this mortgage fraud, was the very first subprime mortgage scandal in the United States, because prior to these programs, these mortgages, because they were subprime, nobody wanted to do them. They were risky. They were going to lose their money. But by the FHA insuring the loans, they were in no danger of losing their money. They were basically no risk loans to the banks, to the people
Mhm.
making the loans. So in 2000, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, this crime came back in full force, and it was more sophisticated and involved more money and more families. And it was a big thing in the United States, and then affected economies worldwide. And it's known as the 2007 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah.
And so a movie was made of it called The Big Short. And there was this one scene that was like a repeat of the scene from this these investigators that had testified to the Senate about it, where this one character uh, looks at the guys, the bankers that are explaining what they're doing, and he goes, "Wait a second," and he goes off, goes aside with his coworkers and said, "Why are they confessing to us?" Just like the guy had in the 1960s. And his friends and his coworker says, "They're not confessing, they're bragging." And so he goes back, and again, like this guy from the 60s, he said, "Do these people that you're selling homes to, did they know what they're getting into?" And he responds, you know, we target, immigrants. And you tell them they're going to get home, and they'll sign anything," which is exactly what they did in the 1960s and early 1970s. They targeted families of color and especially immigrants. They would sell homes to people who didn't speak English and had no idea what they had signed. They said, "You're signing a rental agreement," and when in fact they had bought a home. And another thing that I didn't write about, because the book was big enough as it was, but they were also targeting veterans and doing the same thing to them.
Oh, okay. So in the 60s, say if you're coming in the early 70s, you were coming back from Vietnam and you'd lost everything, they were basically using that as a way of targeting you and getting you to buy a house. I mean, that's cruel. I mean,
I
that's
know,
yeah.
it's like the cruelty is just unbelievable. I I wish I had gotten to know the perpetrators at all, but everyone in the cases that I was writing about, that I could find, is dead. But I wanted to know what kind of person does this. Like, I understand greed, but I don't understand, once you've started and you see the aftermath of what you've done and how many people you've irreparably harmed, how can you continue? Like, it's like you're not human. And
So,
I started to say earlier, like, there was a real problem in the United States with civil rights,
mm,
and these programs certainly wouldn't have solved them, but by allowing at least a certain percentage of families of color and immigrants to buy homes would have been such an important step, such a would have affected people's lives in such a positive way that it would have made a difference. I don't know how that would have snowballed, what would have happened from there, but I don't think that we would be where we are now had these criminals not committed the crimes that they did.
so let's put some meat on the bones in terms of late 60s, early 70s. Who are the prominent names in the FBI investigating this, and who are the most prominent criminals at this point that were perpetrating this?
Well, I focused on a company called the Eastern Service Corporation because they were the largest
Mhm,
mortgage bank committing these crimes in New York. But when the guy said everyone was doing it, he was telling the truth. It was everyone. Mortgage banks, commercial banks, though I can't prove it and the prosecutor couldn't prove it, but probably commercial banks. Every like small service, like small, I can't find the word, like one or two person real estate broker operation. Everyone was doing it. I went. There's a thing called property cards that are they're stored at the municipal archives. You can now see them online. But I went there and pulled a lot of property cards for East New York, and you look at them, and it lists every owner of every building. And so, starting from around the 30s to the 60s, it was usually the building would stay in the possession of one family, going to, father to son or daughter, that kind of thing. But the same owner for decades. And then
mhm.
all of a sudden in 1968, new owners everywhere I looked, and it would list the owner, and it would list the bank that granted the mortgage, and Eastern Services name was all over that. But it wasn't just them. So when that Secretary of State's his investigative committee came across these crimes that were involving federal programs, um, he realized it was these crimes are being committed, but they were out of his jurisdiction. So he um, forwarded what he had found to the Eastern District of New York that covered Brooklyn. This is a federal court for the Department of Justice, and handed all his files over. But what happened was it just sat. So the got assigned. So the guy the U.S. attorney who he talked to said, "Yes, I see the crimes." He signed it to an AUSA, and it sat on that guy's desk for months and months and months. Because, I mean, it's like anything else that I've been talking about. It was mortgage crimes, which are not sexy. I mean, uh, if I had known that someday I'd be writing a book about mortgages, I'd go, "No, never happened." And so that AUSA probably felt the same, like, "Who cares?" And plus, it was happening in East New York, Brooklyn, who cares about them? And it sound I this is just conjecture on my part, but it sat on his desk for months, and it eventually was, turned over to a new, younger ASUA a new ASUA called, Anthony Acetta. And he took one look at them, felt, the rage that I think everyone should feel when you see what was happening, and he's like it was his mission to find these people and prosecute them and put them in jail, and so I outline that in the book. The FBI, it was a similar story. People started to find evidence of crimes, first blockbusting and then these mortgage fraud. and they brought it to the attention of the FBI, and the FBI put them straight to what's called a zero file, and that means nothing was done or was going to be done. But when the Secretary of State found these crimes, discovered these crimes, and gave it to the Eastern District contacted the FBI. They took another look and said, yeah, this is something we need to look into. So a real FBI investigation was launched, and um, Jim Snigaki, along with other agents, but he's the name that's jumping to my mind, was the lead investigator on Eastern Service. But they identified the four largest perpetrators, and Eastern Service was the number one, but there were three others who I briefly outline in the book, but I focus mostly on Eastern Service.
Yeah, it's the manpower to investigate this must have been immense because it's not like white collar crime isn't like a typical of everyday crime in the sense of say if you have a burglary, yeah, you go in, someone will go in, burgle a house, come out, leave clues, etc. That's more or less simple. Same if it's a murder. White collar, you're trying to navigate. You got all this evidence. It's like where do you connect the dots? Where do you even begin? There's no obvious roadmap in terms of how to start investigating white collar crime in many respects, unlike say a crime of burglary or a murder. So the manpower to this must have been immense, and that's just for New York. Heaven only knows what it was like for the rest of the country in regards to investigating this as well.
Yeah, that you just identified the two main problems. The first one is it's not always obvious when you've been a victim of a white collar crime that you are a victim. Like they saw that homes were foreclosing at an alarming rate in East New York and across the country, but it's not a crime to foreclose on a building. It's unfortunate, but it's not immediately obvious that anyone has committed a crime there. So that's part of the problem. Then once you do realize that there is a problem, when a white collar financial crime, you you hit the nail on the head. The biggest issue is that it's very expensive to prosecute a white collar crime. It takes time. It takes methodical investigation, gathering paperwork, finding and witnesses, and flipping them so that they testify. And then he said it put it best. He goes, I start at the bottom and work my way up, but that takes time. You have to identify the witness, get them to trust you, and then work your way up the ladder. That takes a lot of time. You have to gather paperwork and evidence. That takes a lot of time. And that's also very expensive. I forget what they told me, but they, ended up, you know, copying I don't know, several 100,000 pieces of paper, and that adds up. And I've lost my place in my train of thought.
Yeah, it's just saying
But
about yeah.
yeah, it just takes time, and law enforcement, they want to get those cases. They want their numbers to climb, so they're going to focus on cases that they can solve quickly and easily, not these things that could take a year or more. And that has only gotten worse over time.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
When I when I saw this story, I had been wanting for many years to write a book about the lack of prosecutions in white collar crimes. I became aware of it when I was researching unsolved murder, when I saw, how much time and money goes into investigating and arresting and jailing street criminals, and how almost nothing. I mean, it's just, people say, oh, but they prosecuted this person and this person. It's like a handful compared to thousands and thousands and thousands of street criminals that are arrested like on any one day. And the destruction from white collar crime is, I think, more destructive than street crime. Like, they are not just affecting one person and thereby affecting their family and friends. They're, you know, destroying communities, they're destroying society. And if people think no one gets hurt and no one dies from that, they're wrong. And that's one of the things I tried to show, like the murder rates. East New York became known as the murder capital of New York, and it became the murder capital of New York, starting with those destroyed homes.
Yeah, which is something I want to discuss a little bit later. But when you're researching this, as you say, it's very difficult in terms of prosecuting white collar crimes. But in terms of researching it, it must have been, again, like I said before, in terms of prosecuting, where do you start? Because not only do you have to, it's like that meme with the guy and he's got like all those post-it notes and he's got like string attached to each one and he's wondering where the plan is. Not only would you have to do that, but also I imagine you would have had to have read up on the laws of the day in regards to what's legal and illegal, and those must have been very hard as well. So how long did it take you to actually research just the understanding of white collar, not just white collar crimes, but white collar crimes as it would have been back in that time period?
Well, exactly. Like Tony Aceta told me about how in the beginning he said, like, they quickly discovered that the government were also part of what I call this criminal organization. And so he said, There's no way I'm going to be able to do this without the cooperation of the FHA." And the person who was the head of the FHA at the time, well, HUD actually, the Housing and Urban Development, and the FHA was folded into them, was George Romney. And that is Mitt Romney, who was until recently a senator. That was his father. George Romney at one point had run for president. He lost to Richard Nixon, but Romney was very popular, so he made Nixon made Romney the new head of HUD. That's the Housing and Urban Development.
Yeah.
And I write it this in my book, but in Nixon's mind, he's burying Romney. Like, who cares about HUD and what they do? But George Romney, as far as I can tell, was an extremely decent man of integrity who felt very passionately about civil rights. And so he took to being that new head of HUD. He made it, it was his new religion. And he was going to um, build housing, rehabilitate housing, and solve the problems that he was mandated to solve. And that was to affirmatively further fair housing, make housing available for families of color. And so Aceta realized, I've got to meet with Romney, and he's like just this young AUSA. Aceta had been working in a very upscale firm, but he realized, he's just starting out, and he's going to be carrying briefcases for the other attorneys for the next 5 years. But if he worked for the Eastern District of New York, he can do cases right away. And so he switched to that. But he was a young guy and relatively inexperienced. And here he is having a meeting with George Romney, telling him he's going to investigate the Federal Housing Administration, which is under, Romney's command, which couldn't have been fun for Romney to find out. I talked to a lawyer that Romney had assigned to help Aceta. And he said, George Romney really was a man of integrity, and he was shocked, genuinely shocked when he learned what was happening. He had more faith in humanity. He couldn't believe that this was possible, that people would hurt each other in this way. So Aceta went in that meeting, and he had to convince Romney to help him, and he also had to convince Romney to keep quiet and not tell anyone. And which must have been really hard for Romney, because if he believes that these things are happening, he couldn't do anything to stop it, beyond, now he knows what they are. He can, put policies and stringent policies in place to make sure they don't continue, which is what he did. But they did continue. and continue to this day. So we assigned another lawyer to help Aceta because of just what you said. These mortgages are complicated. These new programs are complicated. I went through and read them, and I had to get real estate people to explain them step by step because it's not comprehensible English. Like
Mhm.
I don't know how to explain it. It was like it was written in another language. I couldn't
Like
understand
legalese,
it.
basically, yeah.
Yeah, and with a lot of money, and statistics and terms and percentage, it was hard. It was hard. So I knew how Isetta felt. That's how I felt. So Kennedy worked with him, and they flipped other people within the FHA. So they were they were aware of what was happening and gathering paperwork the entire time. Like now, when these crimes happen, the criminals are more sophisticated. They know exactly what paperwork they need to hide or obfuscate and just make sure is never come to light.
Yeah.
That didn't exist at the time that I'm writing about. So they were gathering up paperwork as these crimes were being committed. They also, they got assigned, Romney assigned 2 appraisers to go through all the applications, which are not simple applications. I can't, I outlined in my book what that had to be done. Now it's gone out of my mind now that I don't have to know it anymore. But they would go through, there's like several steps that have to be gone through. They would go through all these applications and find evidence of fraud, like where information about the homeowner's income and occupation, tax records, where all that was made up. And so they were gathering this paperwork the entire time. And I think the investigation went on, I don't know, for at least a year and a half. There was like a time for preparing for trial, and then the trial went on for 9 months.
Gosh. And what was the result of the trial?
Uh, Mostly guilty pleas. Excuse me. Tons of people were invited. Excuse me, indicted, and a lot of them just pled guilty right off the bat. For the people that did, like on the I forget how many it was for the indictment. I think it was 50 people who were indicted originally for the case that I ended up writing about. And in the end, 9 of the indicted stood trial. I think it was, I can't remember, like 7 people in 2 companies, but I could be remembering that wrong. And most of them were convicted. Uh, Dun and Bradstreet was one of the companies that had been indicted, but that ended in a mistrial. Dun and Bradstreet was part of one of the steps to the FHA um, uh, insuring a loan. It was their responsibility to look at the reports and look at the applications and say yes, everything is valid and on the up and up in these applications, and put their stamp on them. And Aceta and others believe that people within Dun and Bradstreet were being bribed to okay these applications when they knew that they were fraudulent. And to this day, I don't understand why that ended in a mistrial, because it seemed to me that he had sufficient evidence to prove that. He had people who worked in the company who had seen this happening over and over and over again. These applications that were clearly fraudulent were being okayed, and these women testified at the trial. They told about one time where they would call each applicant and go through everything in the application. That was the way it was supposed to happen. So they were calling this one applicant, I can't remember his name, so we'll just call him Joe Smith.
Yeah.
And 2 women at the same time were on the phone with Joe Smith going over the application, believing, each one believed that they were talking to the same Joe Smith. And so they put him on hold and they went to the head, the I forget what he's called, the head appraiser. He's got an actual title that's going right in my mind. And they said, "We've got Joe Smith on the phone. What do we do?" And he goes, "Just go with the one that you believe the most," which is like, oh, okay, now addressing the problem. So with testimony like this, they still got off. So, Dun and Bradstreet got off, the appraiser at Dun and Bradstreet got off, but they actually got good, like, not great sentences. I mean, considering the aftermath of the crime. Like, I think of this book in court, like, if someone's murdered, they allow the family to make statements at the end when sentencing's being considered. It's called a victim statement. And
Mhm.
I consider my book, East New York's victim statement. So considering the crimes, I think the longest sentence was 10 years, and I think the rest were mostly in the 2-year range. And I found that this was also a problem, with the white collar criminals. Like, the very few times that they actually get investigated, arrested, and brought to trial and convicted, the sentences are never equal to the crime. Usually it's just a fine that they can easily pay, go home, and commit the same crimes again. And it reflects this attitude, in law enforcement and in society. You talk to anyone that's the same way, they're like, "Wow, they're basically good people, they're not like street criminals, who are evil villains," which
Mhm.
kills me. They're actually the real evil villains. Like, so many street crimes are crimes of desperation, though not all. There's definitely evil street criminals. But these guys, like, they are knowingly, carefully plotting out complicated crimes. They're not, oh, they just weren't thinking. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the aftermath of their crimes. And they know that people will die, and so they're just as bad. So this idea that they're not bad people. We don't need to, go overboard and send them to jail.
Yeah, indeed. It's now when I showed a book in front of a screen at the start of this interview, I just mentioned the main title of the book. The subtitle is, and I'll read it: "The First Subprime Mortgage Scandal, a White-Collar Crime Spree, and the Collapse of American Neighborhood." And I did say at the start as well that you link this on to crime that happened later, because I kind of think it underplayed like how bad New York was in the late 80s and early 90s, because it wasn't just the most violent city in America, it was arguably like the top five violent cities in the world. It was horrendous. And you, in a sleeve, you talk about one particular person, Julia Parker, and in fact, you actually reference her a little bit, as you go on about the story as well, how she was murdered in 91, I believe. So, how did these crimes, that these white collar crimes that happened in the late 60s, early, like in the 70s, how did they lead to like the higher murder rates in the late 80s and early 90s, at least until Mayor Giuliani came and basically cleared the city up?
So my book is two threads. One is East New York and its decline, and the other is the FHA scandal, occurring, the investigation, arrest, and prosecution. So they start roughly in the same time, and I wanted to connect to the unsolved murder. So I picked one unsolved murder, to feature in the book, and that was Julia Parker, a 17-year-old girl, as you said, who was murdered in 19, was it 91? No, close to that. And
91, yeah.
uh, so she was born in 1974, I believe. So I show her being born in New York, and I just constantly throughout the whole book go back and forth as the trial and prosecution proceeds. I show East New York declining, and I show exactly why I think the two are connected. So even though the FHA chapters stop in the 1970s for the most part, and the East New York chapters continue into the 1990s and beyond. Because I want people to, as I'm showing the neighborhood decline, I'm showing why, and I want them to go back constantly to it's because of this, it's because of this, it's because of this, and I show why. Even though I'm going beyond 1970, it's still because of this, and I very, very carefully show each thing degrading, when, and what was the response to things declining and the lack of response, and directly connecting it to these foreclosed buildings. It's hard for me to explain in a
Yeah, yeah.
thing what took me a book to outline, but trust me, the connection is there. I mean, I invite anyone to show me where I'm deluded or wrong.
Yeah, I know, obviously you focus on, Julia Parker, but as you say,
I showed Julia Parker, she was born into a neighborhood that was already in decline, but her family happened to get, 2 buildings on a block that was nice. And so I show East New York, just declining and getting closer and closer and closer and closer and closer until finally there's a crack house on her block. And all of this, like, the street crime arose because of the degradation of the neighborhood, and then the response from the city and from the police department, and all departments whose responsibility was to address the problems occurring in East New York, never adequately responded.
one thing I forgot to ask you, because we've talked about mortgages and you briefly mentioned about rent as well. What was the social housing like? Was there any social housing back then? In regard, because obviously what you said is talk about mortgages. Was there any what was the social housing like back then? Because it seems to me a lot of it back then was either mortgages or privately rented. Was that the case back then, or was it more?
What are you counting as social housing?
So how's it probably different from here in America and the UK? But in the UK, you have like a certain number of houses that are basically run by councils, i.e., like counties, so to speak. Is there something similar in America where you have like certain like houses that are like built by, I don't know, a city, so people can go in there if like they're struggling for housing, or like I don't know how best to
We don't really have a good solution to these housing difficulties in the
yeah,
United
yeah, yeah.
States. But for in the beginning of the book, homelessness was um not really a problem yet. I'm not saying there were people without homes, but there weren't people without homes. There were, but it was very few. So they had shelters, but the shelters were these dangerous, awful places. And at one point, I forget the year, but Andrew Cuomo was the head of HUD, and he came up with this idea that instead of shelters, which were these just large rooms, open rooms filled with cots, to have buildings with apartments for families that needed housing. And this was really, there was nothing like it. It was a very new, exciting, and effective idea, and they built a number of these um, I guess, social housing in East New York, for families that were struggling and needed a place to live, and those exist to this day. But there's certainly affordable housing. Um, it doesn't really exist. What most people call affordable housing just means housing that's below the market rate. Not really affordable, just less criminally expensive.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Gosh. I mean, this just reading what I've read so far in this and how on earth they managed to get away with it is just mind-boggling to me. And I know you said like you're more like a historian, you're not focusing on the now, but I imagine based on because I'm basically what the sentences you said, I think one got 10 years and the other's got like around 2, sometimes 3 years. Based on that, I imagine that not very much has been done in terms of tightening the legislation in regards to this. in those years since like the 70s, or has it been like I don't know, maybe you can tell me that.
Well, what I can tell you is right now it's all imploding. Uh, e- Everything is getting rapidly worse due to the current administration. I can't. I wake up and every day something new and crucially important is being dismantled in the United States. Uh, White collar criminals are being pardoned, and the people that whose job it is to investigate them and prosecute them are being told not to investigate tax cheats and white collar and other financial criminals, and instead go after immigrants. That's the goal. That's the priority that they are all being charged with. And I mean, when I wrote this book, I I every year I get more and more hopeless. And but when I started this book, I thought it was going to come out in a time when things were starting to turn and people would read this book, and it would be something of a roadmap of what we need to do now. And instead, it came out in a time where people don't want to do anything about the problems that I've outlined. And like the 1960s, people don't believe that the victims that I've illuminated are truly victims. It's that we're going back to blame the victim times.
Mm, yeah.
Like back then, what the blame the victim meme that made the rounds was that this happened to those families because they were unsophisticated buyers, unsophisticated homeowners. I mean, they just they're it just blows my mind that they did this. And what I try to put that argument to bed, with the fact that we had been insuring mortgages for unsophisticated buyers since the 30s, white unsophisticated buyers. They weren't any more knowledgeable about mortgages and home ownership than the families that were targeted in the 1960s and 1970s. But nothing happened to them. There was no big scandal. There's always been fraud, but no large, massive, influx of fraud being committed on those families. And that's because they're white. It didn't happen until we were started selling homes to people of color, and they were targeted. And they were targeted because the people who were committing these crimes knew that they could get away with it.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. It's
It's like a grim it's
yeah,
grim.
it's
It's
been
ultimately so grim. Like the Kerner Commission, when they said to Johnson, America's a racist country, here are the problems that need to be solved. They said only a massive, massive response is going to fix this. You can't just do a little bit. You have to do a lot. And we
mm,
never did, and it doesn't look like we're about to now.
yeah. I think especially because I mean people talk about affordability of homes. It's just we've got the same situation in the UK. It's nigh on I mean it's hard to afford homes. Like the average age of people getting on the housing ladder in this country is going up and up and up. Like so many decades ago, being in your 20s, now it's closer to like mid to late 30s. It's and you don't know what's gonna. I mean, I dread to think what's gonna happen to people in like 20, 30 years time, unless I've got parents who've already bought a house and then the house is passed on to the kids. But yeah, it's a horrible time at the moment, certainly in terms of housing. But as I say, like, what can you do? It's hard to. Well, first of all, things need to change, but how do you go about changing it? But also, like I say, in terms of white collar crime, it's unless you have like a dedicated department that actually trained to do this, which is going to cost a lot of money. Then what can you do, so to speak?
It's going to take a massive response, and a massive response means a lot of money.
Mm, indeed, indeed. What about just finally then, finish this now? What about yourself? Because obviously this is your latest book. How many books have you written now?
That is my seventh.
Seventh book. So have you started planning for your eighth book? What's going to happen with your writing career at this moment?
I I do have a few ideas for my 8th book. We'll see if my publisher is interested in any of them, but one of them is a criminal justice book. I would love to just briefly mention it if that's okay.
Yeah, so I've go for it.
The book that I wrote before this was called Damnation Island, Roosevelt Island, which is an island in the East River in New York City.
Mhm.
Was bought by the city in the 19th century, and they used it for public health. Basically, they built a lunatic asylum. That's what it was called at the time for the
Yeah.
poor, a hospital for the poor, housing for the poor, and 2 prisons. And so my book was a history of that, and that was when I became aware that this problem of lack of white collar crime prosecution has always been the case. Because I found this case of a warden saying in an annual report to the commissioners, he goes, we can't help but notice you never send wealthy people to us to prison, and we
Yeah.
know they commit crimes too, so what's up with that? Anyway, so I noticed at one point that women were being arrested more than men, which was very unusual. So I looked into what crime were they being arrested for, and the crime was disorderly conduct. And that's a law that's very broadly worded that basically just says if you're being a nuisance in public in some way, the police can arrest you. But it's so broadly worded that in practice, it came to mean whatever the police and the courts wanted it to mean. So they used the disorderly conduct law to target groups that they wanted to keep in line. In the 19th century, that was women, apparently, and Irish. Like the Irish were being arrested right, right, and left. So even though my book ended in the 19th century, I just found that so interesting because the fraud laws, the financial fraud laws, are also equally broadly worded, so they could be used any way that people want
Yeah.
to more effectively go after crime, but they weren't. Anyway, so I looked at I looked at all the Department of Correction annual reports to look at the disorderly conduct arrests, and I saw that they went up and up and up, but it went from women and Irish to people of color, and it was so dramatic that the Department of Correction, I believe in the 1930s, had this whole section in their annual report. It was titled something like Negro commitments because Negro was the word used at the time.
Yeah.
And it was basically like, what is happening? Why are you sending us, what all these black people, has there been a revolution we don't know about? Why? And I just thought that was really interesting because even then the Department of Correction didn't see the racism that was going on. They were just like, why are you arresting black people like this? And they didn't have the answer, but they were arrested for disorderly conduct. So I thought I want to write about the history of disorderly conduct.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. Definitely looking forward to that. Like I say, that seems a very broad definition. In fact, what did they define it as? Because disorderly conduct, was there a broad definition or just saying, oh, disorderly conduct, we can arrest you for
It
any way?
is. It's just like it's insane how broad it is. I don't have it in front of me, but it basically says if you're acting out in public, the police can arrest you.
That's bizarre. So technically, you could have a street party, and if I don't like the music, and you're dancing
Yes.
weird, you're gonna. No,
Yes.
that's
It's
bizarre.
it's ridiculous, and again, it was not used fairly. It was just went after people that they didn't, that they wanted to arrest.
Yeah, yeah. It seems
And to
like
this day, it's used in the same way.
still use. I thought
Oh
it'd be
god,
banned.
yeah. And it's still used mostly against people of color.
So hold up. So they still, because the way you describe it, especially from 19th century, you would have thought, especially after the civil rights movement, it would have at least a body shot law or whatnot. But no, it's still on the books.
And still used and still abused.
How often would it be used? Because I imagine in
It's
this
used
day,
a lot. It's used a lot. If like we have regular protests in New York City, if you step off the sidewalk or is it the other way around? But if you don't like proceed in the manner that the police want you to proceed, they just start arresting you. And then they'll say you resisted arrest, and that's part of that's acting disorderly.
that's mad.
Henry Louis Gates, a Harvard professor, forgot, this is in Boston. He forgot his keys or lost his keys, and he was trying to get into his apartment, and the neighbors called, said this black man's trying to break into the building. The police came, and he said, "No, I'm Henry Louis Gates." Showed them his identification. "I live here. I just don't have my keys." And I don't know the details of what happened, but the police say that he started getting belligerent and aggressive, and they arrested him on disorderly conduct for trying to get into his own home.
Oh,
Harvard
that's
professor.
that's not good. That's not good at all.
No.
That's yeah, yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah, that's terrible. When did they start? Just briefly, when did they start? When was that law brought in to establish disorderly conduct?
If you'd asked me this 5 years ago when my book just came out, I'd know, but I think it was earlier than the 19th century, but not much earlier. I mean, originally, I think the idea for the law was sound, like, if people were being drunk and belligerent and aggressive, they could arrest you and until you sobered up, and you have to appear in court and say, "I won't, be abusive and drunk in public again." It's a minor crime. It's not a felony, it's a misdemeanor, but still, it addressed a certain problem that, comes up from time to time where the police may need a legitimate way to detain you and stop you from doing something. Um, and the fact that it was a misdemeanor, recognizing that you're not arresting them for a terrible crime, it's a nuisance crime, but so I think that was the idea, and that's not a bad idea, but again, in practice, it was used differently.
Because when you're saying it, I would have thought it'd be a crime if you're using it towards free slaves who'd escaped the plantation or free slaves as a way of like, oh, you're just being disorderly by being free, if that makes sense, and using it as a way to like get them back onto the plantation, so to speak, which is why I asked when it was used as a way of controlling that.
No, we had something even more terrible at the time for that problem called the Fugitive Slave Act, which New
Mm,
York abided by.
gosh, awful. Awful. But we have to have hope, have to have hope for sure. I mean, like I said, I read about third of it. I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it. It's a very compelling book. I'd say to people, don't worry about if you think that the whole housing market thing's uninteresting, because you break it down in such an interesting way in terms and an understandable way in terms of how these crimes were committed and the links to the modern day. So I'd really recommend this book. If people want to find out any more about the work that you do, where can I go to?
I have a website, stacyhorn.com, and I'm everywhere: Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, X.
Cool. I'll leave a link to your website in the description of this video below. But Stacey, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about this. All the very best of this book. Thank you for coming on to the 286 Project.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I had a great time.